Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Aladdin. I make videos talking about Islam critically and including topics like leaving Islam and so on. And that's sort of the topic of today's video. Why Muslims don't leave Islam. Let's think about that for a second. I mean, to say it very bluntly, there are a lot of Muslims who do leave Islam, myself included. I'm a prime example of that, and so many of the people watching and commenting right now. But the greater question is, why don't more Muslims leave Islam? If you ask a Muslim, the answer would be obviously because Islam is true and so on and so forth. But when you examine it from an outsider's perspective, I think there's a lot more to that answer. And that's what I will attempt to answer today. You can leave your thoughts in the live chat or in the comments, and I will take comments whenever I can. I'll periodically pause to read them. And primarily, what I'm going to be answering today is why Muslims in Muslim majority countries or Muslim communities find it difficult to even consider the possibility of leaving Islam. And this might not apply to every single person, of course. This might even apply to people who don't live in Muslim majority countries. It might even apply to people who are members of another high control group, not just Islam. So there's something, for everyone to learn today. So let me know in the comments if you have any thoughts. Like I said, let's begin with what does being a Muslim mean? It might seem like an obvious question, but it isn't. If you go by the traditional Islamic definition of a Muslim, it is someone who believes in or says the Shahada, which is the profession that you witness that there is no God but Allah and that Muhammad is His messenger. Someone who essentially does the five pillars of Islam, which are saying the Shahada, Salah, praying on time regularly, Zakah, which is charity in a specific way, fasting during Ramadan, and doing Hajj if you are able to afford it or if you're physically capable of doing so. So that is the basic definition of a Muslim. But when you look at it a little bit deeper, there are a lot of Muslims in the world who don't even fit that definition. And Muslims argue among themselves, can you even point that out to someone? Is it rude? Is it halal? Is it haram to say you are not a Muslim because you don't pray and so on? But that's not what I'm concerned with today. The point is that even the classic definition of a Muslim doesn't quite apply because there are a lot of Muslims who don't adhere to these, or not all of them, or maybe don't even practice at all and consider themselves Muslim. So, what does it mean to be a Muslim? I want to start by saying that most Muslims in the world, by a large percentage, by a large margin, are born into the faith. Just like most Christians are born Christians, even though there are people who convert, from one religion to another, or from no religion to one of these religions or another one. The majority are people who are born into it, and that is not really. There's not really option to opt out of being a Muslim. To give you an example, I grew up in the Middle East, and the country where I'm national, where I was born, my ID still says that I'm a Muslim. Yes, it is on some government IDs in some countries. I can't change that. I mean, I could go to a government office and say, I fill a form and say I switch to a different religion and I want to put Christian there, for example. But if I were to say just put no religion, a lot of them would be puzzled. They'd look at me like I'm crazy, and I might even run into issues in my life if I get pulled over and someone looks at my ID and it says nothing. Um, so it's not really a feasible option to officially opt out of being a Muslim. And most people don't even think twice about doing so, even if they're not practicing Muslims. Being Muslim is an identity. It is the most important part of a Muslim's identity. By definition, you are a Muslim first, and then a citizen of whatever country you're in second, and so on. So it is something that is so central to a person's identity that it is inconceivable to part ways with it. So by default, someone born into a Muslim family is counted as a Muslim and expected to continue being a Muslim. And in many cases, they're even pressured if they're not behaving like a Muslim. They'll be called out by people in their community, or there might be legal repercussions if you do things that are considered haram. There are places that would treat you differently. If you're not a Muslim, you have a certain set of laws. If you are a Muslim, you're expected to follow these laws. And you can't just get out of it by saying, well, I'm not practicing. I don't care. I'm not a Muslim anymore. you'd still be forced to be a Muslim. So, long story short, most Muslims remain Muslims because they have no other choice but to be a Muslim, at least on paper. And Islam is, it's not like a religion that you just deal with on Sundays. It's not something that's personal. It's something that is ingrained into every part of a Muslim's life, even on a societal level. So in Muslim majority countries, um, it's in the language. When you say "see you later," hopefully, inshallah, that's mentioning Allah in the name. Wow, you have something amazing. You say "mashallah" to protect them or yourself from hasad, from the evil eye. There's a lot of superstition. There's a lot of use of Islam in language that even if someone is not religious, even if they're not deeply thinking about what they're saying, they're subconsciously just affirming that Allah is real and Islam is true, and there's not even a possibility that it could not be. I mean, it's Islam being true is almost a fact of life in these places. It's like humans need to breathe air. No one thinks twice about that. I've never in my life sat and thought, but do we? And if I did have that thought, I'd just hold my breath for a little bit and realize, no, we do need air. Uh, but yeah, no one really questions, is Islam possibly false? At least in the earlier stages of their life, or if they didn't have a lot of exposure to any suggestion that Islam could be false. Um, and that's another thing. The way that Islam is spoken about in the media or referenced or just even in passing, it is almost, not almost, it is always positive. It is not just neutral, it is a praise of the religion and everything about it. So you'll never come across a critical piece in the news in a Muslim country about something or another that is caused by Islam. I mean, if you do, there's always a lot of backlash, and people assume that it's humans that are imperfect. It's not God or his religion. This is because Muslims are human and they're fallible. But it's never really discussed critically. No one gets to question openly, is it true or not? And it goes even beyond discussions about religion. I'll give you an example. This is something that I come across often these days. I'm scrolling on Instagram and I come across a reel of an airplane, a Saudi airplane, or it happened over Saudi Arabia, that had a compressor stall. For aviation geeks out there know what that is, but essentially the engine's blowing out fire. It looks really scary. It's not that big of a deal usually. Pilots are trained to, shut off the engine, use the other engine, the plane can still fly and so on. And it happens for various reasons, and it's not really that uncommon. And a lot of people in the comments were saying, well, this is not because of pilot training that they were saved. This is because of Allah. Allah saved them. Alhamdulillah for this miracle of saving those people, and so on and so forth. So the video had nothing to do with Islam whatsoever. It's just because it's over Saudi Arabia and because the audience is primarily Muslim, Islam is inserted into every little thing. I mean, I've seen similar videos over, places that are majority Christian, or at least on paper majority Christian. And sure, there might be one or two people saying, thank the Lord for saving them, but it's not really every single comment. Every single top voted comment is just glazing God for his help. Um, they don't stop and think, does this sort of thing happen over other countries or in other countries? What happens in that situation? What happens when the pilots are not trained? How much work went into ensuring that when an emergency happens, it's not that bad of an emergency? It's mostly just, God, 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 and so on. So the point of that is to say, it's by default, everyone is a Muslim. It's by default that you can't even for a second wonder, could there be something else? Could there be another way to explain the world? Or if I don't have another explanation for the world, do I have to take this one? Even people who live among Muslims in Muslim majority countries are expected to follow the rules. Just like, and Muslims point at it and say, well, just like you're supposed to follow the rules in any other country. But it's not just follow the rules, to ensure everyone's safety and so on. You should follow the rules to protect the feelings of other Muslims. You should not dress in a way that might offend them, even though you're not really doing anything to them. You shouldn't say certain things. You shouldn't even eat or drink during Ramadan, even if you're not Muslim. a lot of times Muslims get really upset about that, and you might even get in legal trouble for it. So it's a lot of pressure to just acknowledge Islam as a fact of life rather than a theory. So I'm not really surprised that a lot of Muslims don't get to the point of even questioning Islam. So all this discussion so far, all what I've said, is about why don't Muslims have the chance to think about Islam critically, let alone people who do think about it critically. We didn't get to that point yet. Um, Moving on. If someone were to leave Islam, what does that really mean? Like, so if someone doesn't believe that Allah exists or Muhammad is his messenger, or someone doesn't really think too deeply about it and doesn't follow the religion, is that considered someone who left Islam? Well, if you ask some hardcore Muslims, they would say, well, yes, that person is a kafir because tariq as-salah is a kafir. The person who neglects prayer is a kafir, and some might even say must be punished, but a lot would say, God will punish them in the afterlife and so on. But for the most part, you know, you're just a bad Muslim. And some Muslims even think of themselves that way. I personally know Muslims who do everything haram more than I ever did before or after I left Islam. And at the same time, they think to themselves, I'm just a bad Muslim right now. I just don't want to deal with any of this stuff. I don't want to think too deeply about it. I'm still a Muslim, but God judges by intentions or something or the other. So there are people who manage to keep their Muslim label or identity, even though they don't really follow the religion, if they can get away with not following the religion. So to say that someone has left Islam is not just that they don't practice or that they don't really believe, it's that they take a stance and identify differently than their identity as a Muslim, which is not easy or feasible for a lot of people to do. Um, I to say I'm not a Muslim anymore is not just denouncing your belief in Allah and Muhammad. It's to also say I am denouncing a part of my identity, a huge part of my identity. So you might have a question for me, which is, how did you do it, Aladdin? Um, I'll tell you part of the reason why it was feasible for me to denounce part of my identity in that way, or even though that wasn't what I was explicitly doing, I was able to part with, a part of my identity because I never truly felt like I had any choice in the matter. Um, I was a Muslim before I even knew my name. When you think about it, I learned to pray before I understood why I'm doing any of that stuff. And even when I understood why, it wasn't presented as an option where you can do this or you cannot. I mean, if you don't do this, you'll go to hell and you'll burn forever and ever. And we'll get to that in a second. So even back before I officially left Islam, even when I was practicing or even when I was struggling to practice, I never truly felt like I really deeply was a Muslim. And Muslims might point at that and say, "See, no real Muslims leave Islam," um, which is funny because for all intents and purposes, I was a real Muslim. I did everything like a Muslim should, but I never was attached to that identity because I always felt like there was something off with me because I always had critical thoughts and questions. I just didn't know that these could be. I mean, let me rephrase that. I didn't know you could be allowed to have doubts. I didn't know that there was something else at the end of those doubts, that doubts are not just a weakness. It's not just a position of not knowing the answer that explains Islam away, that you could actually be right about Islam not being true. I just always assumed there was something wrong with me, something I'm not getting that everyone else around me is getting. And I talk about that a lot in other videos. Um, but in my case, when I finally faced that I don't believe, when I finally sat down and went through all the questions and talked to as many sheikhs as I could and did my due diligence as was expected of me as a Muslim, which you don't really need to do, but I wanted to do it. That's when I realized if I let go of this part of my identity, that doesn't hurt me. That only helps me. I don't feel worse about myself. I feel better about myself because Islam has made me feel bad about myself, about all the questions that I've had, about all the bad answers that I was given. Um, so for me, it wasn't that big of a deal compared to, I mean, it was still difficult, but compared to someone who still deeply identifies with it and never really faced that much difficulty in questioning or thinking. So that makes it hard for someone to renounce Islam or to leave Islam. Um, yeah, most Muslims don't do that. Even if they don't practice, they're still Muslim. They don't see a reason necessarily to go against that. And the reason why I'm going through all of this, I guess I forgot to mention that, is because when I first left Islam, and to this very day, I ask myself, and I get asked this question: how can someone believe in this religion even though they know this, or even though they know that? And they'd quote something that shows how absurd the religion is, or how unfair it is to one gender, to women over men, or how problematic it is, or how it doesn't even seem to align with common sense notions of morality. And I've even asked myself that question: how could a reasonable, intelligent person believe something like that? And the answer isn't that because they're unintelligent or unreasonable. It's because there's so much that goes into it. It's not just about the facts. It's easier to dismiss the facts about things that you find problematic in Islam than to dismiss the entire package, your identity, the expectations, and so on. Um, and most people, actually, that's one reason I need to add. Most people don't know most of what they believe. And it's more that once they find out something in Islam, if they're told about it through a sheikh or through a friend or through a critic of Islam, they have no choice but to double down on the conclusion, which is Islam is perfect. So how do I justify this? How do I make sense of this? And sometimes they find ways to deny it by saying, this is not from the Quran, this is from the Hadith. So I don't trust the Hadith. It's not the word of God. It's like secondary sources. So maybe, maybe I don't have to think about that too hard. Even sometimes when the problem is in the Quran, they say, well, maybe I don't get the interpretation. Maybe it's a language barrier. Maybe this, maybe that. So they'll try to find an excuse because it's easier to just think the conclusion is correct. I don't want to go through all this trouble. Anyway, going back to it, I will continue to explain a lot of these barriers for why Muslims don't leave Islam, but I'll tell you how I answered the question when I was younger, and someone would ask me, not in the Middle East, "Are you a Muslim?" Either because of my name or my looks and so on, and usually they would be asking because they want to, like, if they're not Muslim themselves, they want to sort of either be respectful of my diet or ask questions because they're curious or something like that. It's not because of any antagonistic reason. So I was in a safe, environment to answer yes or no, however I felt like it. When the person asking me that question was not a Muslim, my answer was usually, it's complicated, because there's so much that I didn't want to get into in that one conversation. Like how, I've always had questions about this. I don't know if it's real or not, but if it's not real, what does any of this mean? What does life mean? I see a lot of problems with Islam and with the way that people practice Islam, and that's not just people practicing imperfectly. People practicing to the letter, people emulating Muhammad, the ultimate example. I see a lot of problems with that. So how can I say that yes, I'm a Muslim, but at the same time, can you stop being Muslim? I didn't even realize that was an answer. Um, so I would answer, it's complicated, when someone would ask me, are you Muslim? I mean, at first I would say yes, but then after many years, I started saying it's complicated. And then if it was a Muslim who was asking me, are you a Muslim? It's usually because they just want to know, um, are you a part of our group or are you not? Like, can I relate to you on some level? Is there an easy way for us to be a clan? It's not really because they know what I believe or how I believe or what specifics I believe. We rarely ever discuss that kind of stuff. In fact, I discussed religion with my Muslim friends more than they've ever brought it up to me or to each other, um, because I thought about it. Most religious people, from my experience, don't sit and think too hard about every part of their belief system, because the conclusion is that it's already perfect. So why bother yourself? You only think about the things that are applicable to you, or that there might be, some kind of positive lesson to learn from it. But you don't have to examine everything critically, because why bother yourself with all that? I did, unfortunately, bother myself with all that, or fortunately, I guess. Um, So when a Muslim would ask me, "Are you a Muslim?" I would say, even when I was questioning, I would say yes, because it wasn't always the best setting to go through all of these questions with them or mention to them all the things that make me not sure if I'm a Muslim or not. And again, I didn't know there was a choice to not be a Muslim, so I just said yes for simplicity's sake. Now, when someone asks me, "Are you a Muslim?" I make it a point to say, especially if they are from a Muslim background, I say, "I used to be a Muslim, I'm not anymore." Not just, "I was born into a Muslim family," or "I come from a Muslim background," or "No, I'm not." Because I want people to know that this is possible. You could be born into a Muslim family. You could even practice Islam every day of your life and then leave Islam and then not believe in Islam. That is absolutely feasible, doable, and in many cases better for you. But if you're happy with your belief, no one's forcing you to leave Islam. I just wanted people to know that that is an option because, and that's something I want to get into in a bit. The image that Muslims have of someone who leaves Islam is extremely negative, and it's not realistic in any way. Starting from even the Quran itself, and the text itself, the way it describes people who don't believe or who believe something else, or polytheists and so on. It's borderline. It's not borderline. It is hate speech. The way that Muslims talk about other people of disbelievers or certain groups that they don't like in everyday media and culture, the way they make jokes about them, it's extremely dehumanizing, and it's just normal. No one really thinks twice about it. If anything, the nice ones might think, well, it's haram to make fun of people. Hopefully, God guides them to the right group and to the right path and so on. But for the most part, it's normal to sort of shit on people who left Islam or who don't believe in Islam. So I try to make it a point to let them know we do exist. We're not the way that you describe us to be. And I've made friends with Muslims that way too, where I just tell them straight up, no, I don't believe, and we can move on from there. But for a lot of people, they might be ashamed to disassociate with being a Muslim because it's almost as if they're ashamed of their, say, ethnic race or cultural background or nationality or something of the sort. Because, especially with a lot of hate that is directed at Muslims in a lot of places in the world, it almost, for some people, feels like a political statement to say, "I am not Muslim." Like, you can go hate on these people. I'm not one of them. I don't feel that way. I don't think it's my fault that there are people who do hate on Muslims. I don't contribute to that in any way. And I don't need to take one for the team and, be a martyr and say, "I'm Muslim too," just because some people somewhere hate Muslims. For the most part, most Muslims in the world are not prosecuted in any way, persecuted, not prosecuted, persecuted in any way, because most Muslims are in places of majority. We focus too much on the experience of Muslims in places where they are the minority, that we forget that for the most part, they're the majority. And when Muslims are the majority, it's hard to use all these excuses to, shield Islam from criticism because we don't want hate speech and so on. When wherever Islam goes, there's a lot of oppression towards other people who are not Muslim. But that's a topic for another video. Um, what else did I want to say? Let me start reading some of the comments, and then I'll get back to what I was talking about. Um, Lily of the Valley says, when I was talking about the airplane reel, it's kind of like how many Muslims are saying that the fires in LA are a punishment from Allah because the West is filled with shaitan. Um, yeah, that's one narrative that it's crazy. I came across it. As you might know, there have been fires in Los Angeles in the US on the West Coast. Wildfires. Some think it might be caused, or some of them might be caused by arson. Some are just caused naturally. It's because of dry weather conditions and so on. There are a lot of Muslims, I've seen that myself, who are almost gleeful about it and celebrating it. Not all of them, of course. I don't know if it's even a majority, but there's a big amount of Muslims who believe that in this narrative that, again, the world revolves around Islam. Islam is a fact of life. So they interpret things happening as part of the big story, which is Allah exists and Allah's keeping a watch on everything. And they think that it's revenge for Palestine somehow, or, because Americans are culpable because their government sends money to Israel, therefore all Americans are equally culpable, and God sends fire to punish them, or as revenge or something like that, which is the kind of simplistic thinking that you get in religion, which is, God gets angry, he burns a bunch of things, or he punishes a bunch of people, just without really any nuance or any thought to who he's harming in the way. Um, and it's hard to be someone who doesn't think that way in the crowd. It's hard to see your family members and friends think that way and grow up to be different, because at the end of the day, we are products of our environments. We don't have as much free will as we like to think. And people who make it out, there's usually a break in the pattern or some quality of theirs that got them to think differently. And sometimes it's just randomness. So it's no surprise that statistically most people will continue thinking the same way they've been indoctrinated to think, and the way that they see people around them behaving. Um, Pasta says, I think a lot of modern Muslims do that. They blame the negative aspects of Islam on culture. I used to do this myself, but as I learned more, I realized that these issues were entrenched in Islam. Yeah, it's easier to just dismiss everything as bad Muslims or bad humans. I used to do that too. Bakir says, I'm depressed and suicidal after leaving Islam. Well, I hope that you are able to reach out to someone who can help you, because I know what it feels like to be in that position, and you need to reach out for help through friends, family, if you're capable of doing that. If not, through organizations in your area that do cater to people in distress. So please, please do that. I want to talk about this later in the stream. I guess that's one more reason. Let's do it right now. One more reason that a lot of Muslims don't leave Islam is because they see that the alternative is a bleak and miserable and depressing reality. And it's no surprise that you, dear commenter, feel that way, because when you go from having an explanation for everything, even the bad things, when Allah was real, when you were a Muslim, there was an explanation for everything, and now there isn't. Now you're left to make sense of the world all at once. Reality has kind of shattered, and it's up to you to figure out what it all means. That is a lot more difficult than growing up in an environment where you never had the easy answer of God did this, God did that. Add to that you view the world differently than everyone else. You feel different than everyone else, even if you're not explicitly being harmed by other people. You feel like you're not part of that group anymore. It's not easy to feel alone. Even if you're surrounded by people, you feel like you're the only person there who thinks that way. So none of that is easy. I understand. I mean, I assume that I understand at least part of what you're going through, and you're not alone, but it does get better. I hope that you're able to find the resources that you need for help, and find other people who are in a similar position to you, and figure out how they left the depression behind. I used to feel this way even before I left Islam, because that constant confusion of why isn't reality matching with the description that I was given from this religion, um, that was constantly depressing, and I didn't really realize it at the time. But even after I left, it was depressing for a different reason. That how does everyone not see what I'm seeing? Am I crazy, or are they? Because that's the dichotomy that we're given as believers. And what do I do about everyone in my life who continues to treat me like a Muslim? Do I keep lying to them? Do I tell them the truth? What are the repercussions, and so on and so forth? But it's all manageable. It's all doable, and I hope that you find a way out of it, because a lot of us have found our way out of it. I really wish you the best. Thank you, Lissa Mora, for the super chat and for being a member. Lissa says, the phrase "a caged bird doesn't know how to fly" means that someone who is severely restricted or limited in their environment is unable to experience the full potential of their abilities, just like a bird confined to a cage cannot properly fly. Yeah, I saw that commented a couple of times, and I think it's very applicable. That analogy could work very well on someone who's in a restrictive environment, where the thought of dressing differently or believing differently or questioning something is so unfeasible that it feels like a crime, that they think that flying is a crime, and that they don't know how to do it. That is very applicable. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Ahmed says, so you were depressed because others didn't leave Islam. What a pathetic thing to say. Maybe that's a miscommunication on my part, but that's not what I mean. It's as if, let me put it this way. It's as if you live surrounded by flat earthers, for example. And flat earthers, at least, I mean, day-to-day topics, like you're driving to work, you work with that person, you need to fill in spreadsheets. It doesn't matter if the earth is flat or round. It doesn't really interfere in every aspect of your life, but it's still kind of alienating to think that everyone around you views the world differently than you, even though you obviously see it the real way, or at least you see it more realistically. It's kind of alienating. But then add to that, imagine if every aspect of your life, a flat earther brought flat earth into it and everyone around them cheered them on. And you're the only person who doesn't think that way. That is the depressing part. It's not that I wish everyone would leave. It's more like, how hasn't everyone come up to the same conclusions as me? Why are they so wrong about their conclusions? And why do they continue living arrogantly as if they're right and forcing it on everyone else, including myself? So I hope that explains that. Um, I mean, this is a more befitting analogy and kind of more on the nose. It's like living amongst people who support child marriage and sex slavery. You look at them different, that they're just okay with this. And I guess that's something I want to highlight. Not all Muslims believe in these things or think that they're good, but these are things that Muhammad himself participated in. And if a Muslim is able to think that no, Muhammad didn't do these things, or I don't believe this text, then they can kind of push the problem aside. But if they're forced to reckon with the fact that, as far as we know, I mean, I say fact because as verifiably as we can tell, according to Islamic sources, he has done those things, then they'll find a way to make it make sense. And that is extremely depressing. I've heard family members and friends try to justify these things, and you just look at them as like, I don't know you anymore. And it's not because they like these things. It's not because they would have supported them otherwise. It's not like they support them happening right now, or they would even support them if they saw them happening. It's more that Muhammad did it. He's a good person. He didn't really make a mistake. So therefore, it must be good in a different way. It's it's like it's like watching everyone you know make excuses for an abuser, essentially, and it can be very depressing. Muhammad preached for freeing slaves, yet he had slaves himself, and he didn't preach against. I mean, he said that you get brownie points with God if you free slaves, but you're allowed to trade them. You're allowed to take them during war. You're allowed to buy them even during peacetime. Your slaves' kids are your slaves still. You're allowed to have sex with them, which is a power dynamic that they can never have consent. So no, Muhammad did not really preach for freeing slaves. He said it's good if you do it, but there's even a hadith where he sort of I wouldn't say reprimanded, but when one of his wives said that she freed a slave of hers, Muhammad said it would have been better if you gave it to your relatives. You would get more thawab, you would get more brownie points with God if you gave the slave to your relatives as a gift. So no, he wasn't all that concerned with ending slavery. And that's, again, a lot of Muslims believe that narrative because they don't have the time to really look into their religion, or they just keep hearing the good, propaganda on and on. They didn't really think about it, but that is a fact. Look it up yourself. Don't take my word for it. Anyway, moving on. So why don't Muslims leave Islam? Um, let's ask the question a little differently. Why don't they question Islam? Well, a lot of Muslims come from cultures and communities where questioning an authority, especially if they're a family member or a teacher or someone older than you, is a big no-no. It's disrespectful. It is almost a transgression, a crime. And there's a big emphasis in those communities and in those cultures and in Islam in general on respecting your parents, which are primarily the source of your religion. When you're first born, it's your parents who teach you about it, and then you graduate to either learning about it through scholars or the teacher at school or at your religious school and so on. But respecting your elders is a big part of that, and respecting tradition is a big part of that. So to question Islam or to do something that Islam says you shouldn't do is akin to a grave crime of not just going to hell and all that kind of stuff, but you're disrespecting the structure that you grew up in. So it's not something that a lot of Muslims are capable of doing or ready to do or primed to do. There's also a lot of propaganda. And by propaganda, I mean, if you look up the definition, something along the lines of information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. Like, for example, that Muhammad, freed a lot of slaves and Muhammad really helped end slavery, when in reality, slavery did not end in the Middle East till a few decades ago because of external factors, not because of Islam in any way. Slavery markets were still a thing. And, there's also modern forms of slavery, but that's a whole other topic. But slavery as it was allowed in Islam existed till the 1980s at the very least. So that's propaganda. There's always some sort of show on TV during Ramadan or otherwise, that's teaching you all the good things about Islam or all the good things that Muhammad did. Some of them might be true, some of them are exaggerated, uh, but you never really have public information about all the bad things Muhammad did, or it's not really called bad. So your only exposure to information about Islam as a Muslim, up until the advent of the internet, which is not that long ago, was positive. Like you wouldn't watch a TV show where someone is having a discussion about Islam. There are just very few examples of an attempt at that. Like there was, for example, one time a guy who's an atheist in Egypt who was invited onto a TV show to have a discussion about why he's an atheist, and within minutes, the people on the show were cussing at him and shouting at him. I met that guy in person in Norway last year, by the way, which is pretty cool. It's such a small world. But yeah, like they're not capable of having that discussion, and if they do try to have that discussion, it's not really something that is broadcasted. So the average person doesn't have a lot of chances to come across something to make them think critically, or come across any information to make them think that they need to think about this differently. They need to examine this in any way. So for the most part, everything's good. Islam is great. That's why you keep hearing all the time. Um, what else? If you ever hear something critical or negative about Islam, and I'm not saying negative as in manufactured to make Islam look bad, the way that Muslims view any negative information about Islam, but something like, for example, how Muhammad participated in and allowed sex slavery, how Muhammad was in a lot of wars, how maybe Islam is pretty sexist towards women. Maybe Islam should not allow a man to hit his wife for any reason. That sort of stuff is not something that you come across in mainstream media or from any source that seems credible. Because, I mean, think about it. I am just some guy with a microphone and a camera. I don't have a production team. I'm just by myself in my living room. It's not the most credible source of information. So if a Muslim were to come across this live stream or any other one of my videos, um, they might very easily think, who do I believe? Institutions that have existed for over 1,000 years, people who have learned this stuff for decades, that dedicated their life to this stuff, or some guy with a camera? Of course, I'm not going to think twice about it. And like, in a way, do you really blame them? I mean, to bring the analogy to science, the scientific method is nothing like Islamic knowledge, but let's just make that analogy. We all take the word of scientific consensus, more or less, or a lot of us do, a lot of us don't. Um, and if I were to be some guy with a camera, like just like I am right now, and I go against the scientific consensus, even if I am right, even if I have the data, it would be very hard for a lot of people to believe me, because unless they do the experiment themselves or unless they look into the data themselves, they'll just think that someone else did the work for them. All these institutions have done the science. I shouldn't believe this one guy. And I say science, and the analogy, again, is not really totally befitting, but a lot of Muslims do view Islam as a science, as a ilm, because ilm means knowledge, but also kind of could mean science. So there seem to be a crossing of wires where they think that that there's some sort of actual science involved. Like science involves experimenting, involves testing a hypothesis, involves being proven wrong and trying a different one. None of that is the case in Islam. In Islam, there's the fact that is being told about Islam. There's maybe disagreement about details and, looking into texts to try to figure out interpretations and all that kind of thing. But I wouldn't call that a science in any way. Um, Maybe like some sort of historical analysis, if you want to call it that. But a lot of Muslims think it's synonymous with science. So if you come across opinions that are not supported by or endorsed by the science people, the guys who do this for a living, you're not likely to think that there's any merit to it. So on some level, I understand when a Muslim hears me talk and thinks, I don't believe you. I believe the people who do this for a living. And even if I were to do this for a living, even if I were to get degrees in Islamic studies, it's still just one guy. It's not a consensus by any means. So as much as we like to think that we're all critical thinkers and we're all individualistic and so on, we're social creatures. So of course we're going to go with the crowd. Even atheists, even religious people of other groups, everyone to some extent needs to go with the crowd in order to lighten the load on themselves. You don't really examine every single belief that you have day to day. And Islam is just one of those things for such people. And the way that a Muslim views the world, and I say that from experience, and a lot of you might relate, is that Islam is the center of the world. It's the center of the universe. It's the center of why we're here. It's the answer to why do humans exist? Why is evolution a thing? I mean, evolution was not a thing back when Islam was revealed from God. It wasn't mentioned, but now there are a lot of Muslims who kind of acknowledge it as a thing. But why did God make evolution happen? Why is that a mechanism? Why do animals exist? Well, the answer is Islam. The answer to everything in Islam. There was even a myth that I learned when I was younger that the Kaaba is actually the center of the earth, or like, somehow that it's the center of the earth. How do you have a center on a sphere? I don't think it's even the center, like land mass wise, but that was a belief that I was told. And I don't know if I really had that belief, but I was told it. So by virtue of that, if any event happens anywhere across the globe, it has to do with Islam somehow. If you're suffering, it has to do with Allah and Islam. If you're having a good time, it has to do with Allah and Islam. They're primed, believers primed to think as everything as part of the story of Islam in one way or another. So to think that there could be an opinion that says Islam is not true, well, that's already addressed in the Islamic narrative. Those are the disbelievers. Those are the haters, for lack of better terms. Those are the people who don't think, they're bad, and so on and so forth. So they already have an answer in advance for what that is. So it's not likely that a Muslim will be engaging with such ideas or such people. And I'm not saying on a personal level. There are a lot of Muslims who get along with non-Muslims. I mean, if it's information that's coming from a source that is critical or negative, as in doesn't paint Islam in the best light, or honest about the reality of a lot of things in Islam and how, at the end of the day, it's never been proven, just like every other religion, that information doesn't come from a Muslim, because if it did, that Muslim would be a kafir. So obviously it comes from an outsider, which in an Islam-centric worldview is part of a very easily dismissed conspiracy theory that someone is always conspiring against Islam. And again, this is not unique to Islam. You might have heard of how there are always these conspiracy narratives about how people are fighting against Christianity, or there's a war against Christmas, or stuff like that. There's that persecution complex that really helps cement a faith. Because if you're under attack, if you're a group of people and there's something uniting you, which is that you're under attack, or your common values, your common identities under attack, you're more likely to cling on to that identity. So when you look at wars that happen all around the world, including in the Middle East, when you look at Western influences and meddling in the Middle East, that fulfills a religious narrative that explains to them that, see, what Allah said was true. They're doing that because they hate Islam. They're doing that because they hate you. They hate Allah, and because the shaitan is part of it, and so on and so forth. In reality, there are other explanations, which, greed and like there are real reasons why people do evil things that aren't because the devil made them or because they hate this one religion. I don't think that it's because Islam is their target. There are many, many reasons why there's meddling in the Middle East. I mean, oil is the biggest reason, and that's not really Islamic. But point is, what was I saying? The point is that a believer is primed to believe in a conspiracy theory that everyone is kind of conspiring against them. So if someone were to try to have a critical conversation with them, it's easy to think that's the devil's influence, or that is someone who's actively trying to mislead me from the truth because that's what God told me would happen. So you see, there are a lot of barriers to someone questioning Islam. Even a critical discussion of Islam or criticism of it is viewed as an extremely negative and antagonistic and hateful and evil act. So if you watch my channel for long enough, you will know that I am generally not a hateful person. Even if I make jokes about a certain topic, that's not because I hate the topic or someone who believes in it. It's because I'm trying to show people that humor can kind of get you to think critically, and it's sort of a comic relief for us sometimes. But that's not how it's viewed by a lot of believers. Criticism of the religion is viewed as an attack against them, as something that is unfair, that should be stopped, that should not be glorified or engaged with. Even though when you think about it, Islam at its core is extremely hateful towards a lot of groups. And that doesn't mean that every Muslim is hateful. I'm saying if you open the book, the Quran, open it, just read what God supposedly says about people who believe differently, or who don't believe, or who believe in multiple gods. You'd think that there was a handbook for how to oppress other people, but somehow it's viewed as religious freedom to have these ideas. It's not viewed as hate. But if someone were to say, hey, that's hateful, that is considered hate. And it's hard to think otherwise. It's hard to stop thinking like a persecuted person, especially if you are truly persecuted for other reasons. It's easy to link everything to I'm being persecuted because I'm Muslim, Islam is being persecuted. Any criticism of Muhammad or Islam is because people hate us or hate Islam. I don't hate. I don't really think it's productive to hate. I'm just pointing out things as they are, but it's not always easy for a religious person to see it that way. What else? So one more thing to point out. If you're a man who's a Muslim, there are a lot of struggles that you may have with Islam, but on average, they're fewer than the struggles that women have to go through. For example, a boy at the age of 9 doesn't have to worry about suddenly changing their wardrobe and covering up and possibly wearing, a hijab and being viewed differently by the males in their life, and having to sort of hide themselves and act differently. All the stuff a woman has to go through, or a girl has to go through when she first even begins to have puberty, to go through puberty. Men don't go through that. So there are a lot of things where men have the advantage in Islam. That's not to say that men don't struggle under Islam or men cannot suffer, but on average, their struggling and suffering is smaller or less frequent than women. So that means that if your life is going okay, under Islam, if anything, if Islam caters to your insecurities, like say you're someone who's insecure about being with someone who's been with someone else, right? In Islam, that other person, someone who's experienced being in a relationship with someone else before, is labeled all sorts of derogatory things and ostracized and so on and so forth. So you don't have to contend with your insecurity. You just get to live the way that makes you feel comfortable, and you don't have to think too hard about it. So if you're someone who that applies to, and a lot of Muslim men that does apply to, the religion serves them instead of really harming them, then you don't have an incentive to think and change your ways, or think, what if none of this is true? Because it works. It works for you. And unless you're extremely empathetic and you're thinking about the experience of women or other people, then you don't really have an incentive to think critically. So that is why a lot of Muslim men don't think critically about Islam. And that's why a lot of women have these questions sooner than men, or a lot of girls have these questions sooner than boys, because they start thinking, wait, how's this fair? They ask the questions that no one thought to ask. Sure, God says that I have to cover up my hair. because God says so and because men and so on. But why did God create me that way? Wasn't God capable of creating two sexes or two genders, where you don't have one that has a lot more power over the other physically and that has to be protected from the other and has to hide their hair? Couldn't have God created things differently? That is a question that a man doesn't really need to contend with because he doesn't need to change that much about how he lives his life, but a woman does. So again, that is maybe a reason that a lot of women go through these questions before or more intensely than the men. But on the other side of the coin, for the same topic, sometimes a woman goes through all of that suffering as a girl and as a woman, and then she gets to a point where she does think critically about the religion, but it's hard to continue thinking critically because she's already invested so much. If she's struggled so much because of Islam to please God or to be a good Muslimah, and then it's all for nothing, it's all not real, that is a lot more hurtful for some people than to continue living the life that they've already um, participated in building for themselves and to enforce that on other women in their lives, because that's what I had to go through. That's what you have to go through because that's the way it is. It's almost like a sunk cost. I've invested so much into this. I can't turn my back on it now, and that also applies to both genders. It's or all genders. Someone can feel like they've dedicated a lot of their life to Islam on by choice or otherwise, or because they didn't want to go to hell. To leave all that behind, or to then believe or acknowledge that maybe it's not true, is extremely difficult, because that means that all that I've suffered was for nothing. And I don't agree with that, but I understand how easy it is to arrive at that conclusion or be afraid of that conclusion. I wouldn't think that in that situation it's all for nothing. Um, it's not really for anything. Nothing is for something, in my opinion. It's just something that you went through that shaped you into the person that you are today. And in many ways, you didn't have much of a choice but to be the person that you are today. But you have a choice now to be different. So even if you've suffered a lot under Islam and you're afraid that if I acknowledge it's not true, then it was all for nothing. Well, isn't it better to acknowledge that now and face the thing that you already think than to continue living a lie just because you've invested so much into it? Um, I still have a lot to say. I've been talking for a while, but thank you, by the way, for all the help that's going on behind the scenes and for the moderators. Let me let me read some comments and then I'll get back to it. Lily of the Valley, thank you so much for the super chat. Says, don't have anything important to say to in this comment. Just wanted to support you. Thanks a lot, and I really appreciate it. And Lissa, thanks for the super chat and for gifting a bunch of memberships and the supportive message. Keep doing what you've been doing. You're doing an amazing job, and I've learned many things for you. I appreciate it. Let's see. I can't read your name, so excuse me because I can't, but I'll read the comment. This person says, I'm a doubting Muslim. I don't even know what to identify myself as. It feels like I'm a walking contradiction. Um, I guess what I want to say about that is that you don't have to rush to identify as anything. And I don't want to make it seem as if you have to right now take a stance and, go change your government ID and go tell everyone what you believe. But it's good to acknowledge within yourself before you make, any sort of statement about it. What do you think? How do you identify? It doesn't have to have a label, but don't put yourself in a box. Just try to think through how you think and what you believe, and try to reach out to other people who've been through the same thing. That's what I can say. And someone like the commenter who's a doubting Muslim and possibly on their way to leaving, or maybe they'll even go back. Such a person is still considered to be a Muslim statistically. So that is the why don't Muslims leave Islam? Because the illusion is that no Muslims leave Islam. And that illusion keeps people from leaving because you don't want to be the only person who left Islam, or one of the very few people in your community or in your environment who left Islam. So that's another reason. Let me address this comment because it's actually something I was going to get into in a minute, but now's a good time. Ahmed says, you yourself don't even have a moral ground or framework, yet you want to help people who are questioning. What are you trying to bring them towards? I'll address that more in details later, but that's something that the first part of that comment is also something that keeps believers in their faith. You don't have a moral framework, moral ground for framework. I do, but if I tell you it, you still wouldn't accept it to be the one that you like, which is that I try to maximize happiness and minimize suffering for myself and the people around me. Of course, it's not as simple as that. How do you measure happiness? How do you measure suffering? How do you prioritize yours versus others? What's the greater good? What's the individual good? There's so many questions that go into this. I don't have a set of rules that say you have to enter the bathroom with your, left foot or right foot, and you have to do this. You have to eat with your left so that the devil doesn't get to you. And maybe that's disappointing. Maybe you need a set of rules to follow, but I don't have that for you. I have some basic premises, and then you do your own work from there. But for a lot of believers, they're used to having a set of rules to follow, which are so convoluted and old that they often don't even really apply, or they're really dealing with superstition instead of reality. But just having that seems like a better option than not having it, or having an answer might seem to some people to be a better option than not having an answer. So they might be intimidated by the idea that if I leave Islam, I don't have as believers call it, an objective morality. And by objective morality, they mean God said it in a book, allegedly, therefore it's objective. In reality, we don't know that God exists, let alone that God said anything. But that's not what defines objective morality. But I don't believe that there is such a thing as objective morality. I think everything is relative, and we just try to do the best with what we have. And some people might not like that answer because they're used to loudness and hubris almost. Ironically, people who leave or question are accused of being arrogant, of thinking that they know more than God, or they know more than all these people who studied Islam and all these people who thought about it before them. You think you have the answer. You must be very arrogant. In reality, it's more humble to say, I don't know, and we're trying to figure it out, versus I know for a fact because God told it to a guy, or told it to an angel who told a guy in a cave, and we just have to believe that. Let's be real here. But again, it might be intimidating because we're expecting a definitive answer. And for someone to leave and not have a definitive answer for a lot of these questions is scary. But I'm telling you, it doesn't have to be. It's more wonderful and more it's more amazing to think about, like, for example, watching a nature documentary. When you watch it as a Muslim, and even there are Muslim shows that do that, it would just be all subhanallah, glory to Allah, this is all beautiful, look at the designer, he made everything. That's such a boring answer, though. I mean, and it's a nonsensical answer that God put so much effort, so much work into, billions of years of creating the universe, and it evolving to the point that where it is today, and life evolving over millions of years, just for him to specifically choose one species at the end, and not just the whole, not the whole species, but just towards the last part that we're aware of, and say, hey, women, you have to cover your hair. How does that make any sense? It's not just a boring answer, it's a nonsensical answer. But when you look at it and you think, how did this all come? And we don't know how. It's a more marvelous question to ask. And it's more marvelous to study the mechanisms, for example, of evolution, than it is to say God created everything. And then when we find out about evolution, well, God made evolution too. That's boring. And it's not just boring, it's inaccurate. Anyway, moving on. So that's one more thing, is that we're primed to expect definitive answers, and we're primed to think that having loud and definitive and arrogant answers is better than being humble and saying, I don't know. Alexa, thank you for the super chat. And I'm not awake as well. Thank you for the super chat. MashaAllah, this has decreased my faith in Islam. Keep it up. So this is a play on words, because whenever someone talks critically about Islam, you'll find comments from believers who say, MashaAllah, this has made me more of a Muslim. Almost like, what's the word? Like stubbornly saying, you thought you shook my faith. If anything, you made it stronger. I mean, that's the equivalent of putting your fingers in your ears and saying, la, 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 I can't hear you. I'm still a believer. This isn't for you. And I'll talk about that later in this stream. What am I trying to do here? What's the purpose of my work? And it's not to get everyone to leave Islam, because that will never happen. That will never happen. Anyway, moving on. Why don't Muslims leave Islam? I'll give another reason. Socioeconomic status. There are a lot of people, and you'll see that with other religions as well, who are not doing well. they're not earning a lot of money, they have more kids than they have income, or they have diseases and not resources to fight it, or they don't have the infrastructure to become a person who has all of this value, not value, like valuable resources or assets in their life. Like someone like that is not in the position that they're in because they're worse than someone like me. It's because for a big part of it is the privilege of being born in an environment that supported me and gave me opportunities to be richer than them. But for them, there are sometimes situations where it's hard to get out of, no matter how hard you try. It's not proportional to the amount of work that you put in. And the only other answer seems to be hope. I hope God makes my situation better. And sometimes their situation does get better, whether or not because of other people in their life helping or because of their own efforts. And they attributed that to God because God gave them hope. And sometimes even if they give up on this life, they're in a very dire situation and they think, at least in the afterlife, I'll get something out of it. A lot of people are more likely to think that way if they're desperate. But when we see the statistics, the more that people have money, the more that people are happy, the more educated people are, the less likely they are to be religious. And again, when you think about it from a Islam-centric worldview, there's an explanation for that too, that keeps someone in the faith. Because Allah had said, oh yeah, before I forget, thank you for reminding me, Peter. Peter, please like the live stream. Please leave a comment. It really helps. Anyway, moving on. What was I saying? Yeah. So when you look at people who, have more in life and are more privileged and become less religious or are less religious as a population, Islam explains that as humans are ungrateful and arrogant. When they need something from God, they pray hard. When they don't need something from God, they forget God. And that's an explanation that makes sense to a Muslim. Oh, okay. So people who don't believe because they have money, it's not because not believing, makes sense to them. It's because they're ungrateful. But narratives are kind of easy to push you in the wrong direction. In reality, it's those people are less desperate to rely on hope from an unseen entity or to invest a lot of their life into something that may not give anything back, which is an afterlife. So if you're not desperate, you don't need to do that. So there are a lot of places, unfortunately, in Muslim majority countries that people are not doing well, and they're not likely at all to leave religion because that's their only hope left. And again, that's not exclusive to Islam. You see that there are a lot of countries and communities in Africa, for example, that have a huge Christian population, and they cling to Christianity harder the less they're doing, the less well they're doing in life. So that sort of human desperation is understandable. Yeah, where was I going with this? So people clinging to religion out of desperation is one more reason why people don't leave Islam. For example, there were even Jews were persecuted so many times throughout history, and I don't want to name it explicitly because I don't want to get the stream demonetized. But even while they were being persecuted, a lot of Jews still believed that they were God's chosen people. They still prayed to God. They still thought that the narrative made sense somehow. So it's not that the worse that God treats you or the worse that life treats you, the more likely you are to leave. It's almost the opposite. Moving on. Yeah, and if someone in that position, in a very desperate position, leaves Islam, they're left to not only contend with the existential questions that you and I have to contend with, that people in this live chat have been saying they're depressed because they're contending with. They also have to contend with the fact that their life is explicitly or more, their life is especially miserable, and that it's very hard to get out of that situation. So it's understandable that they wouldn't really want to make that step. So what if someone does question Islam? What if someone is a Muslim and they do question Islam? Why don't they leave then? Well, there are a lot of answers for that too. First and foremost, if you do question Islam, most of the time it's met with a lot of hostility. So not always. I myself have spoken to a lot of sheikhs and they manage to keep their cool to some extent. But you have to ask in a very timid way. You have to essentially bow your head down and say, I know that there's an answer here. I'm sorry to be asking such a rude question, but why did Allah do this? Or why does Islam say this? And if they manage to keep their cool and, answer you, it's always going to be that there is an answer out there, either that they have it and it doesn't make sense to you, then that's your problem, or that there's an answer that only God knows. And you're too simple minded to think of that. You're too simple minded to come to a conclusion because your mind, it's nothing compared to Allah's. So questioning, even when it is entertained, is not really properly engaged with. Most of the time, it's discouraged. I mean, on surface level, yes, Muslims say Islam encourages critical thinking. Sure, but only critical thinking to get you to believe that Islam is true. Any other sort of conclusion is not allowed. Any sort of question that is deemed offensive or rude is not allowed. And so, what was I talking about? Yeah, questioning. So if you humble yourself and you ask a question, assuming that you're wrong and you still want to know the answer and so on, um, you're not really going to get anywhere. Like you'll never, and that's speaking from experience, you'll never talk to a sheikh, almost never, that says, you know what, that's a good point, and I hadn't thought about that. Or I know this makes it seem like God is cruel, or I know this makes it seem like this doesn't fit the Islamic narrative, but you just have to do it. Like that is a concession that they might make, but for the most part, it's just that you're not seeing it right. God has an answer. And let me talk about that for a second. Is the stream still on? I think my face is frozen and it doesn't look very good from where I'm standing. Okay, it's back. Your mind is too simple compared to Allah's. And on face value, almost seems like a good argument. Like, are you a simple human thinking that you know better than the creator of the universe that is obviously very, very capable of creating everything, including yourself? Of course you can't. So you just take the answer that God gave you. But is it really that I am sitting here right in front of Allah and having a discussion, and Allah has demonstrated that He created me and is capable of everything, and demonstrated that I cannot think to the quantum computing level, many times over that He can, and then says, therefore, just take my word for it? That's not what's happening. What's happening is there's a guy who believes a guy who believes a guy, and at the end of the chain is a guy who says that he spoke to an angel who spoke to God. So you can't use the authority of a hypothetical where you are disagreeing with the creator of the universe to then say, see, the creator is right. That hypothetical did not happen. We're just arguing, if the creator were here and the creator said so, then I guess I have no choice but to concede that there might be something I'm missing. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is someone claims that the creator says so. And in that case, there's a lot that I can contend with and a lot that I can object with without being arrogant. I'm not being arrogant when I say, I don't believe that what you're describing is God, or I don't believe that what you're describing is consistent with itself. That's not arrogance. That's not saying, if God is real, I know more than God. So don't let religious authorities kind of use that unearned authority to shut you up and shut up your critical thinking. What else? Yeah, so we mentioned briefly how you're not supposed to question your elders. You're not supposed to question tradition. You don't really question your parents or your teachers or your sheikhs. I mean, even when you do, you have to do it very respectfully and meekly. And at the end of the chain, essentially, isn't God just the ultimate expression of that humility and shyness and inability to question? I mean, if that's the attitude you're supposed to have towards humans in your life who are a bit older than you, what's the attitude that you're supposed to have towards God? And every idea is backed by God, even though it's never been demonstrated to be backed by God. That's what the argument sort of poses, is that if you object to something, if you have a doubt, if you have a question and you refuse to accept the nonsensical answer, you're not just saying, I don't believe this sheikh, or this doesn't make sense to me. You're saying, I know more than God. You're disrespecting God, the ultimate elder in your life, which is very hard for a lot of people who grew up not challenging authority. Let me, I guess, engage with some comments. Ahmed says, you don't question a doctor no matter what drugs he gives you, but you want to question Allah and everything. Actually, I feel like I've already addressed that. you should also still question your doctor. I mean, obviously, you can see that the doctor probably knows more than you, but you still have the option to go ask another doctor. Hopefully, you have access to healthcare and you have the time to go do that. But that's an option. You go check with another doctor. You do some research online, and yes, your research is not going to be conclusive. You don't have all the information, but it's something. It's possible to have a two-way conversation. With Allah, you don't really have a two-way conversation. You have a guy who says that he spoke to Allah, or someone down the chain spoke to Allah, and he has an answer. Um, so yeah, it is our right to question, to verify that the person that you're talking to actually is someone who's representing Allah, but that has never been proven. Also, the doctor is in front of me, as I'm Not Awake says, the doctor is real. We know that for a fact, and you can still question the doctor. Anyway, moving on. What else? One more thing that keeps people from questioning, in Muslims or otherwise, is the fear of hell. I've spoken to people who used to be Muslim, or are still Muslim. I suppose they're confused about where they are in the questioning process, and they say, "I don't believe that God would have said this and that. I don't see any proof that any of this is real, but I'm scared. What if it's true? What if hell is real? What if I'm going to hell because I was precisely told to not do this and yet I did it anyway?" Because questioning, even if a sheikh is nice about it, they'll tell you questioning is the work of the devil. Doubts are the work of the devil. Critical thinking is the work of the devil. They don't say it that way, but effectively that's what it is. They say critical thinking is good, but whenever it doesn't lead you to Islam, that is the work of the devil. And it angers me, honestly, that in 2025 there's still people that believe that the devil exists and that he's manipulating your thoughts, and it's such an insidious concept that, again, you wouldn't believe unless you were taught since you were a kid most of the time. Some people believe it in adulthood, but for the most part it's something that's indoctrinated into you. It's unfortunate because it could drive people insane. It could drive people into questioning their own questioning instead of questioning the nonsensical answer that they were given. So it's, fear of hell. Even someone who doesn't quite believe that any of this makes sense. I've made this analogy before. The reason people play the lottery, for the most part, or one of the reasons, is that the reward is huge compared to the risk that you lose. When you lose however much money you put into it, which hopefully you didn't put a lot of money into a lottery ticket. I'm not saying you should go and gamble. I don't think gambling is a good idea. But if someone were to buy a lottery ticket, they're essentially gambling. The odds are astronomically low that you would win. But at the end of the day, what? You lose $10, or at least that's what they think, unless they keep doing it a lot. You lose $10, you gain 100 million. Even if you lose, it's no big deal because the magnitude of what you might win is worth the risk. Islam is the other way around. I mean, heaven could be sort of thought of that way, but you have to invest a lot more than $10 to go to heaven. But hell is a huge magnitude of suffering, endless magnitude of suffering. Even if you have to put in a lot of effort to avoid hell, even if hell is not really, you're not sure if it exists, even if the chances are astronomically low that hell exists, if you're unlucky enough that the chances are it does exist, even if it doesn't seem that way to you, you're going to suffer for eternity. So the magnitude of suffering makes the equation so that you fear it anyway. But if I approached you today and started fear-mongering something that is unproven, that no one has evidence of, that is a new concept, hopefully, if you're not gullible, you're likely to just shoo me away and say, "I don't care about what you're talking about." I could be a scammer and I, get you to believe me, but for the most part, you can shoo me away. But if that's an idea that you grew up with since birth, that's an idea that's not just, common to your religion, but the concept of hell is shared among a bunch of religions, then it's harder to shake that fear. Because even though you don't believe in it, what if it's true? That keeps so many people in Islam to a degree. And that is Pascal's wager. Yeah, as the Boer pointed out, that is Pascal's wager in a sense. And it's sad because I've spoken to people, and when I say that they stay in Islam, it's not that, okay, I'll just continue to pray every day and like fast and pretend to be a Muslim and then I'll be happy. They're still questioning themselves. They know they're pretending to be Muslim because they're afraid of hell, and they fear that God's going to send them to hell anyway because they don't actually believe. You see how insidious of a cycle that becomes? And let's pause for a second. Why is God threatening people with hell? Not for doing bad deeds, but for not believing. That's like if I, how do I put this? That's like if I have a custody battle with a partner, an ex-partner, and I go to the judge and I say, these are the reasons why I should have the kids. Also, if you don't rule in my favor, I'm gonna do so and so to your family and I'm gonna blow this whole place up. Even if I had a case for custody, even if I was legally right, why would I resort to threats? Why? It's only if I'm not confident in my defense and if I'm stupid, and if I don't have the facts on my side. So why is Allah resorting to the ultimate threat of terror, of eternal hell? It's because the person making the claim doesn't have all the facts. It's to cloud your emotions. It's to cloud your judgment with emotions. And it's, again, one of the things that keeps people in the belief is this manufactured aura, this manufactured image of Islam as a super rational, calculated idea that you arrive at it through philosophy and through like thinking hard and like proof and stuff like that. Um, but leaving Islam or questioning Islam, that's an emotional process. That you're not being rational about this. You're not thinking about this. There are emotions in everything that we do, but ultimately Islam terrorizes people into remaining a believer because of the fear of hell. Not just Islam, but I'm talking about Islam right now. So you don't get to prey on people's emotions and then punish them for having emotions or chastise them for having emotions just because they're using them differently or thinking about them differently. Um, but yeah, it preys on people's fears. So not just that. Say someone is not that terribly afraid of hell, or didn't really, they think I'm a good person. I don't think if God is real and God exists that they would punish me, which was kind of how myself and a lot of Muslims have thought about it when we weren't practicing. Like, it's kind of a cope. Like I know that I'm not practicing right now, and it's weighing on me. But hopefully, God is fair. God won't punish me forever for not praying a few times or missing a few prayers. One would think. But what was I saying? Yeah, but even if you're not afraid of hell, there's still that fear that what if I leave the religion or stop practicing and then it turns out it was all true and I don't get to be reunited with my loved ones in the afterlife. So it's like a fear of missing out. Some people, for some people, that's the fear of missing out on heaven, for example. Um, let's address one more comment. Let's pause and address a comment because it's a good demonstration live of the kind of objections you get from a believer when you do talk about these things. So Ahmed says, hell is just a punishment. Hell is a just punishment. Sorry, a just punishment, as in a fair punishment for disbelievers. If you spent your whole life disbelieving in the being who created you, you deserve hell. Again, there's a twisted understanding of so many things that we just take for granted as Muslims, like a twisted understanding of owing or justice or who deserves what. So if you create something, and as they say in Islam, in Arabic, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى, to give an analogy, but God is the greatest. Um, if you create something, and we can't create life, but say you create something, does that thing owe you loyalty and servitude till the end of its life? Does that thing deserve to be tortured, not just for the period of time that it wasn't following you, but for eternity because it didn't give you attention? How pathetic is a God that tortures you to that extent for not acknowledging its existence? Like forget giving God the finger, like say, I acknowledge you're real. I just don't want to follow you because I think you're bad or because I think I'm too good for it, which is kind of supposedly in the stories how Shaitan, acted with God. What does God do in that scenario when Shaitan tells him to F off, essentially? Allah says, well, go to the earth and, try to lead astray as many people as possible. The ones who believe in me, they're not going to be led astray by you. So he unleashed a mental weapon on humanity just for a bet to see how many people would follow Shaitan instead of shutting him down. Instead of shutting down this entity that has superpowers to use against us humans, God was like, yeah, go do your damage. The good ones are not going to follow you anyway. But when it comes to the helpless little humans who, disbelievers, they're not arrogantly telling Allah to F off. they genuinely don't believe in Allah. Allah takes that personally. Allah's like, you know what? I have to torture them, not just for the 100 years that they lived, but for all of time, forever and ever and ever. How does that make any sort of sense? How is that just? How is that fair? And why is Allah so, like, we always hear Allah doesn't need you, you need Allah. But he sounds like a pretty needy, attached, anxious entity, right? When he pays attention to every single person that ever existed and will torture them way more proportionally than they ever deserve. Disproportionately, I mean, isn't that someone who's needy? I don't know, but there's a lot to, you see how, like, I view it one way, a believer views it differently. That's because it's been ingrained in their minds that it is fair if you create something, and it's only Allah who created, so it just works in one situation. If you create something, that thing owes you its existence. It owes you groveling forever and ever. And if you don't do it, you deserve to be tortured forever. Like, you go to heaven, you're still going to grovel to Allah. That's still part of the deal. But if you don't do it, you get tortured forever. How is that? How does any of that make sense? To put it a different way, I think more highly of Allah than believers think of Allah. Like, the way that they describe him is such a petty, sadistic, almost evil entity. And it's one thing if that entity does demonstrably exist. If we know that that thing exists, yet it has those qualities, then I guess for my benefit, I have to follow it or else. But on the other hand, we don't know that that thing exists. And that thing, or the people who believe in that thing, claim that it has a lot of good qualities that contradict these bad qualities that they're describing themselves. It's like almost like gaslighting you, like beating you and saying it's for your own good. It's that kind of abusive, mentally abusive idea. So they describe God as merciful and fair and all that stuff, but also God is petty and sadistic. They just don't say he's petty and sadistic. Or like this idea, for example, it's a perfect example. Ahmed says, well, a son owes his parents. No, and that's the difference between the way that, broadly speaking, from my experience, Westerners think of parenthood and Muslims think of parenthood. In Islam, you're told that you owe your parents. You can't even say oof to them. You can't even express displeasure towards them, which may seem like a nice sentiment. Like, you got to respect your parents. They've sacrificed so much for you, all, and so on and so forth. But also that means they get away with abuse. They get away with anything because they're your parents. And it's ingrained in them so deeply that the analogy is like God is the ultimate parent. He created everything. He's like the ultimate father. You can't disrespect God. You can't question God. Again, we're not even talking about an actual God that does exist and we can demonstrate created us. We're talking about an idea. But to bring it back to the analogy of a son and a parent, you don't owe your parents for existing. Your parents owe you a good upbringing. They chose to bring you into the world. They owe you to raise you well. And then, whatever point they determine that you're old enough to go fend for yourself, they don't owe you anything anymore. It would be nice for them to continue supporting you emotionally and monetarily, whatever it may be. But it's not that you owe them your life because they brought you into existence. And by the same token, you don't owe God. If God were to exist, we're talking about a hypothetical again. It doesn't mean God gets to do whatever he wants and we view it as fair. God may have the power to do whatever he wants, but still we can view it as sadistic and unfair. You see what I mean? Apostate is going to let his kids walk all over him. Well, if you raise them right, and if they don't have any sort of I guess, neurological issues or behavioral issues, then they will likely treat you with respect. And, giving people deserved respect is different than giving respect because they're owed it. I don't want my kids respect because because they came from my sperm. I want their respect if I have kids because I gave them a good life and they love me. Again, a lot of different ideas that we don't agree on. Going back to it, why Muslims don't leave Islam. There's a lot to lose when you question. There's a lot to lose when you leave Islam. So on a very basic level, if you were to admit to yourself that Islam is not true, you lose, or at least mentally, you feel like you lose all the time that you invested into the Muslim part of your life, which for a Muslim is a big chunk of their life. So it already feels like by accepting your disbelief, you have lost. Even though it doesn't really change the past, even though, if anything, you'd be investing more into that part of your life that you don't believe in, but it feels like a loss if you leave the religion. That's not the case. Um, then there's also the way that people will treat you. If say you don't believe anymore and you don't tell people about it, which is, by the way, the ideal outcome for Muslims. Muslims always say, you left Islam, that's fine. We don't need you. God doesn't need you. But you don't have to make a fuss about it. You don't have to be loud about it. You have to be quiet and not lead other people astray like you. It's a very antagonistic and oppressive view. It's like if I said, you want to be Muslim? Just go be Muslim somewhere else. Don't rub it in my face. You can't practice around me. You can't have a beard around me because that is too Muslim. That is what they want us to do. Like, you have to be invisible. Otherwise, you will be oppressed and you will like it. That's how a lot of Muslims, unfortunately, view apostates or people who don't practice or believe anymore. So if you were to stop going to pray, or when people in your life who are Muslim invite you to do things or ask you why you're not behaving like a Muslim, what you're expected to do, and you don't do that, you're already sort of being outed, even though you didn't go to them and say, I want to have a conversation with you about how I don't believe or how God is not real. Most of the time, that's not how it happens. Like, I personally, I don't talk to Muslims in my life. At least when I was doubting, I would ask them questions because I wanted to know how they figured out the questions. But once I realized Islam is not true, I don't go and talk to them and try to, like, push them out of their belief or tell them, by the way, I don't believe, let's talk about that. Most of the time it's that, and if someone spots that you're not behaving the way a Muslim is expected to behave, again, peer pressure, societal norms, that kind of thing, then you're automatically outed as someone who doesn't believe. And sometimes people don't really have a problem with that. I know Muslims in my life. We're still friends. We do favors for each other. We hang out. There's not a problem there. But in a lot of Muslim dominated communities and countries, that is a big problem. At the very least, you might not be invited to events, or people will start gossiping about you. That's like start to be socially ostracized. And then there's a lot more violence and explicit harm to be done to you. There are people who fear their own family members locking them up, or in some stories, even if they're in the West, sending them to another country, or taking away their documents and, like, trying to sort of, I don't know, indoctrinate them back or save them as they might see it. Sometimes there's violence involved, like beating your kids is allowed in Islam. So even if it wasn't allowed, it's, there's a lot of precedent set for it. There's legal ramifications sometimes. There's mob violence. There's so many things that are keeping people from being openly who they are, even if they're not attempting to parade themselves as, I'm an ex-believer. Just being yourself and not masking, not pretending that you're a Muslim, might get a lot of people in trouble. There's also, you're losing your sense of reality when you leave religion, which is why some people get depressed about it or get some sort of existential crisis. Your whole life, you saw the world. The reason for existence is it's a test, and there's reward, there's punishment, all that kind of stuff. You have a way to explain everything, even when things don't make sense. Why do bad things happen to good people? It's a test. God has a solution for it later. Even when there's injustice in the world, well, God's going to take care of that in the afterlife. Don't worry, God has it covered. But when you leave religion, or when you realize it's not true, reality hits, and you realize, wait, what am I supposed to think? Are there forces beyond my control? Are these forces human? Are these forces magic? Are there other entities in the universe? Is there a purpose to all of this? Are there these persecution narratives? What about politics? What about oppression? All of these things, they collapse, and then you don't know how to make sense of the world. So why did my parents die the way that they did? Why did my uncle do that? Why did my aunt do this? And all of these things, now you have to find new answers for, which can be very overwhelming, and you lose your sense of normalcy. For a lot of people like myself, I didn't choose to not believe in Islam. I don't think anyone really chooses to not believe in Islam. It's just the realization that you come to. No one really chooses all that suffering. No one chooses to have their view of reality shattered, but that happens sometimes. So that is something that you risk losing, which is your sanity, or your view of the world, or your explanation for why things happen. And then it's sort of a task that is put on you, if you're someone who thinks about these things a lot, to then find other answers. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very tempting to just fall back to the religious answers, or to think that, be intimidating by the arrogance of people who say we know the answer and this is it. And I'm here to tell you it's okay to not know the answer. And it's not your job to explain everything all the time. It's your job to figure out a way to have a happy life and make, life happier for people around you. That's how I see the world. One more reason why people don't leave Islam: there's no procedure to leave Islam. Like, if you go by the book, if we're talking bluntly by the book, someone who leaves Islam according to Sunni Islam should be, if I remember correctly, you have a sheikh speak to them for 3 days or something of the sort to try to bring them into Islam. And if that doesn't work, they're executed as an apostate. That's the by the book answer. Doesn't always happen, but just knowing that that's what the rule says, you can imagine that reality, if it either matches the rule, it's bad, or if it doesn't, if they don't carry out the rule, it's still going to be bad to some extent, because you're someone who deserves to die in that situation. So there is no official procedure to leave Islam. There is no guide for how to leave Islam. I could try to make a bunch of videos explaining, how to get over your fear of hell, how to deal with problems with your identity and all that kind of stuff, which is what I'm trying to do. But that's not an official guide. That's not a mechanism in Islam that says, hey, you want to opt out? We're going to help you. Here's how to do it. So there is no way to opt out. There aren't a lot of success stories, because what does a success story for an ex-Muslim really look like? The success story would be someone who isn't a believer anymore, and somehow found a way to explain all the things that previously religion explained, and found a way to be happy and continued their life, and maybe kept the relationships that they had when they were religious, or cut off the ones that cannot be kept. That is a success story. That doesn't sound glamorous. That's not marketable. That's not an inspirational story that will gain millions of followers, because it's very mundane. But that is a successful story. But on the other hand, when you have a story of a convert, for example, and that's not just Islam, Christians have that too. It's always a story of, rags to riches, in a sense, not in a materialistic way, but, my life was in shambles. I was struggling with an addiction. Maybe I was doing crimes, or maybe people in my life were doing crimes. Things are really bad. I found God, and then my life is so much better. And it's sold as this, this is what could happen if you join. But there is no such story for this is what could happen if you leave, because best case scenario, you have a good life. But Muslims don't tell you that story, because they don't know that story. I personally did not know of anyone who left Islam, or any stories of anyone who left Islam. And if you look it up online, it'll only be the people who are vocal, like myself, for example, or someone who, I guess the most popular examples of that are Muslims who leave Islam and join Christianity, right? And that is sort of held as a, here's a testimony of someone who used to be on the other side and now they're here with us. And maybe that will get popular. But you don't see a lot of testimonies where people say, I left Islam, I'm happy, everything is great. People do have those testimonies out there, not to, invalidate their stories in any way. And I've had many of them on my channel. But still, the average Muslim has not come across any of that, and likely will not. Let me pause here. I will get back to that. Let me just read a few comments again. Lean, thank you so much for the super chat. Says, honestly, breaking out of the indoctrination was hard. If children were indoctrinated within a different context, like politically, there would be backlash. Agreed, but that's the difficulty with it, isn't it? That parents ultimately have control over how they raise their child, for better or for worse. So it's hard to, stop parents from indoctrinating kids with ideas about hell and heaven and, less harmful ideas like Santa Claus and stuff. But we have to at least raise awareness of the harms that these ideas cause. Homo sapiens said earlier, there is also the illusory truth effect. The more something is repeated, the more people tend to believe it regardless of evidence. Islam deals with that very well with the dua istighfar prayers. Excellent point. In Arabic, there's a mathal, a saying that goes, التكرار بيعلم الشطار, or التكرار بيعلم الحمار. Two different versions, but repetition teaches, good students. Let's put it that way. And repetition does really work. If you are supposed to pray 5 times a day, and in that prayer you say a lot of things that are essentially, Islam is true, God is great, Islam is true, Muhammad is great, Allah is great, all that kind of stuff. You say it so many times. When you're anxious, you're supposed to, hold the sibha, misbah, or whatever you want to call it, and you keep repeating these phrases, glorifying God, or asking God for help or forgiveness. It's thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of times in your life, maybe, that you say a phrase to the effect of, Islam is true, God is great. Now you don't say it literally, but that's what you're telling yourself. So of course it's going to be hard to then think, every breath that I've spent saying that thing, every moment that I've spent repeating that phrase was for nothing. I was wrong. That's a very difficult realization to have. It's hard to even go that far with the question. About something I was saying earlier, Ahmed says, an answer is always better than no answer. You can't criticize right and wrong in Islam when you don't have right or wrong. That's similar to the argument of, well, you have no source of objective morality, so you can't say what I'm doing is immoral. I can just point at how harmful it is. Like, again, you can't say that Muhammad marrying a child is immoral. But I can point to how marrying a child is harmful, typically, and how Muhammad doing it and being an example has caused many people do it and caused harm. I don't know. I don't need to have a direct line of connection with God, if a God does exist, to have authority to make that claim that it is harmful. But also, having an answer is not always better than having no answer. Let me give you an analogy that I've given many times before. If I leave the house right now and I see that my car's gone, there's glass on the ground, and I don't know what happened. Was the car towed? Was it stolen? Did someone I know take it? Was it an ex who decided to take it and destroy it? I don't know. And then a neighbor comes out and says, I saw your car. It like blinked at me. It did some noises like Herbie, that car, the animated car, and it just drove away, and then it flew into the sky. That's an answer, right? My answer is, I don't know what happened to the car. His answer is, it animated and flew into the sky. Just because I don't have an answer right now, or maybe ever, doesn't mean, therefore, him having an answer is better than nothing. I mean, that's just one example to demonstrate the point. Of course, I could do some more investigation. There's glass on the ground. Maybe it was stolen. Someone broke the window. I'll start calling, impound lots. I'll call the police, that kind of stuff. Even if I never know the answer, that still doesn't mean the car flew into the sky is a better answer. I hope that explains that. Anyway, a few more comments, but moving on. I'll read those in a second. So, yeah, the only time that you hear about people leaving Islam from Muslims is tragic stories, or to say they're going to go to hell. Don't be like those people. There aren't many stories where Muslims say, and he lived happily ever after. And you know what? Maybe he has a point. maybe God is the way that we describe God doesn't really, it's not coherent. It doesn't fit within itself. Maybe they're onto something. That never happens. By definition, they can't acknowledge that that is real, that people do leave Islam as good people, or that someone who's a good person deserves to be tortured forever just because they don't believe anymore. So again, conditioning. If all the examples you see in your life are of people leaving and suffering, or which is also another good point, there are a lot of ex-Muslims who leave and talk about their stories, and they suffer after leaving Islam. And that seems like a fulfillment of that narrative again, that if you leave Islam, you'll never be happy. You can't be happy without God. When you might be depressed and unhappy because of the amount of pressure that believers in your life put on you, because of how they view you, because of the answers that you used to have, that now there's a vacuum and you're just left to figure it out yourself. When initially you had all the support in the world to become a Muslim or to be a Muslim, there are resources for that. There are people who will, try to help you to be a better Muslim, but Muslims don't help you be a better kafir. So you're on your own to contend with all of the questions of the universe and of existence later in your life, rather than gradually going through that process as in a secular way, or a way divorced from religion. If you were a child who grew up in a household where religion was not a thing, you probably would ask these questions. Why do we exist? Or why do countries exist, and so on and so forth. And you will start to learn answers that either make sense or don't, but they are answers. But when you're a Muslim and you leave, you have a huge vacuum, and it's just you by yourself. You go figure it out. Of course, it's going to be difficult. Of course, you will face, emotions that you don't know how to handle. But that is not then proof that you can't be happy without Islam. There are a lot of people who are happy without Islam, but when you leave a vacuum because of taking Islam away, or when you leave in a very difficult way, of course you're going to face struggles. So I guess a larger point here is that narratives are very hard to combat. Narratives are more important than facts. If you have a good story, if you have a narrative that can encompass everything, if it can give an explanation for everything, even if that explanation is not factual or true or accurate or sensible, if it fits the story and you're, conditioned to have that story with you, then you're likely to just continue believing the story. Let's see what else. So one thing that I personally have contended with when I left religion, or I was contending with it even before leaving religion, I looked at all the suffering in the world and I thought to myself, what can I, one person, do about this? And when I was religious, or when I hadn't yet left the religion, let me put it that way, I would think, why is Allah not doing anything about it? And that's a blasphemous thought. And you'd start to question. I started to question, wait, is Allah real? Well, the answer is that, yeah, Allah is real. And if he's not helping those people right now, it's because he's a plan. And like, he's going to, either reward them more or take away from their sins, for their suffering. It's all part of God's plan. It's because of shaitan. It's because of people's choices and so on and so forth. But I still felt like somehow, okay, even if Allah is going to reward them in the afterlife, or, there are a lot of people who are suffering who Allah is not going to reward because they're kuffar. So yeah, poor Muslims, God's going to give them bigger mansions in heaven. Boo-hoo, that doesn't even really solve their suffering during their life. But then a kafir who's suffering, God's not going to then put him in heaven because he's suffering, or like reduce his suffering. He will still suffer forever in hell. So the very least I could do as a human on earth is to try to solve some of the problems of the world. But that is a huge burden to bear for a human, and for one human to fix. So even as someone who still sort of believed in Islam, I couldn't see how, this wasn't my responsibility, or I couldn't see how the solution would be somewhere outside of me, or the solution would be within me. I didn't know. And then when I left religion, there's, again, the same realization, but there absolutely is no God to take care of those people. So it might be bleak to then look at the world and think there's a lot of suffering. It's for nothing. There's nothing afterwards. There's no test. There's no reward. This is very difficult to deal with. So again, that might be a barrier for someone to think, I'd rather believe in a world where things suck, but at least in the afterlife, God's going to fix everything, than believe in a world where this is just the way it is. The reality doesn't really care about how you feel about it, but it's understandable that you feeling about it that way would keep you from questioning deeper or from leaving the religion. Thank you, I'm Not Awake, again for the super chat. Says, please continue what you do, even if it's not apostasy focused all the time. You're still a representative for us. We need you to be on Piers Morgan level. Thank you, I appreciate that. And I'll talk about that in a second. So I guess to start wrapping this up, unless you have more reasons that you would like to add to why people don't question, or to view all of what I said differently, these are not necessarily just reasons why people don't question. These are barriers that people face when they do question. So, it's not a death sentence. I mean, leaving Islam can be a death sentence. That was a bad choice of poor choice of words. But I mean, you're not forced to. Like, Muslims can question Islam. It's just very difficult. So exceptions like myself and many people in the chat doesn't mean that it's possible, so everyone is capable of it. No, there are a lot of people whose conditions and situation and capabilities make them almost incapable of leaving Islam. And that's a fact that I just have to live with. I can't speak for why every single person believes or doesn't believe. I can bring them on the channel. We can talk about why they believe or why they don't, which I've done many, many times. But all of this was to summarize a bunch of reasons that I've heard from other people, that I've went through myself. So if you disagree with them, you're open to, you're welcome to disagree. And I acknowledge that people do leave religion. And I'm not, on the title and the thumbnail are not meant to be hopeless, as to say, there's nothing we could do about it. Islam wins. We win by continuing to exist. There's no, the battle is not Islam versus ex-Muslim YouTubers. That we'll never win that battle, ever. The battle is not how much Muslims do we get to leave Islam. the purpose of what I do, I mean, there's many, but what part of it is to let people know that we do exist. That's step number one. Right now, if you look at the official Islamic narrative, even to not that long ago, before the term ex-Muslim existed, people like me don't visibly exist in society. To this very day, I make it a point to tell people that I exist, or people like me do exist. But I'm not comfortable doing the same thing in the Middle East. Like if I were to meet a random person and they assume I'm Muslim, I'm not going to say, stop right there. I actually don't believe anymore, because I don't want to deal with the headache that comes with it. But I want more people to be comfortable talking about these things, or at least they see someone like me and they don't feel alone. So that's one reason, for visibility, for solidarity, for accurate and positive representation, because all that is told about us are religious narratives. Like when you read about the debates that the prophets used to have with their opponents who claim to be on the other side, it was always a reductive, dumb kind of argument. The atheist argument, like the arguments for the anti-Islam arguments, in the Quran, are so stupid. I could do better. So did Allah not really find any opponents better than that fictional, straw man that they were arguing against? Or is this just, a bad story? But unfortunately, bad stories is all that represents us right now. So people like me have to be more loud to offer other stories. Um, and the goal of leaving Islam is also not to then therefore become a vocal ex-Muslim. I don't think anyone, I mean, not anyone, I don't think most people want that burden or that headache. Just like when someone becomes a Muslim, not everyone then starts a YouTube channel about it. There are people who do, and they get a lot of fame from it. But there are a lot of Muslims who just, converts who just continue living their life. And it's not about spreading the message, or it's not about being loud. Um, I don't want to do this. This is not fun. I mean, don't misconstrue what I'm saying here. I enjoy helping people through the work that I do, but I'm not doing it because this is such a fun thing. Because ex-Muslims love attention, and this is a way to become famous or popular. This is a burden. This is something that needs to happen to improve my life and the life of other people in situations like me. It's not because, as Muslims think of it or put it, you can leave, but just don't be loud about it. We need to be loud about it. Otherwise, we will be drowned out by religious voices, and by the punishment that we receive, and by all the false stories that are told about us. So to exist in this world, people who disagree have to live side by side. Ex-Muslims are capable of that. I am capable of that. It is usually the religious side that is not capable of that, because our mere existence, and our mere existence as people who, are all over the spectrum of niceness. There are assholes and there are nice people and everything in between. But just because we're not all the assholes that we're expected to be, that sort of shatters the religious story. So our existence in their midst, openly, vocally, threatens Islam. And that is why it is really, really hard to leave Islam, because if people were allowed to leave Islam, if people were friendly with other people who left Islam on a large scale, then there are a lot of closeted non-believers or non-practicing believers who might then think it's okay to leave Islam. And that's precisely the reasoning they give for executing apostates, because it's spreading corruption in the land. And by corruption, it's people making their own choices. So if you take away the pressure that is put on Muslims, more of them will leave. And we both agree on that fact. A Muslim and an ex-Muslim would agree on the fact that ex-Muslims being vocal, facilitates more people leaving. We just disagree on what that means. We disagree on the narrative behind it. I think it means that more people are empowered to believe what they actually believe and stop pretending and not be persecuted for not acting like a Muslim. They believe that it's the devil doing their work and leading them astray, and so on and so forth. That's what's really frustrating about religious narratives. They're not provable. They're not disprovable either. Because if someone believes in the narrative, how do you convince them that this is not the work of the devil? You have to start by convincing them the devil is not real, but that's not always easy to do. Um, I don't know what else I wanted to add. Coexistence is something that I strive for, which might be surprising, because a lot of critical voices against Islam. Without naming names, I don't necessarily mean um, any particular person. Oh, speak of the devil. I wasn't talking about any particular person, but someone spanning some comments. There are a lot of critical, people who are critical against Islam out there. Um, and the way they do it is sort of like, hey, we have to eradicate this mind disease. We have to take a strong stance and end Islam because it's harmful. I agree that Islam can be harmful to a lot of people. That's what exactly what I'm saying. I don't think that the solution will be eradicating anything. I don't think it's feasible. I don't think it's humane. I don't think it's possible to eradicate Islam. So if that's your goal, you will ultimately fail. And the only people who will get on your side are people who just love to hate, and you're not going to get anywhere productive. It's almost like a circle jerk of people who think Islam is bad. Okay, now what? So it's more difficult to translate that into something more productive and more realistic. Even if someone believes I deserve to go to hell forever, if we want to share this world, if we want to coexist on this earth, we have to, we have to share resources. So I'm okay sharing this earth with people who believe bad things about me, who believe bad things about or unrealistic things about the universe. I'm okay with that. That's just what needs to happen. I don't want to eradicate them. I don't need to eradicate them. The problem is I have to stop them from eradicating me and people like me. And I have to stop them to some extent, or at least be allowed to vocally oppose them for what they do to the next generations and to the current generations. They're going to bring people into this world and teach them these things. And it's my right to oppose that vocally. So I guess what I'm trying to say is coexisting cannot happen by just singing kumbaya and saying we're all human, we just need to exist. Sometimes it's fighting back, sometimes it's pushing against transgression, but at the same time it's not a scorched earth approach where you just say this idea, this religion is bad, end it all. That's never going to happen. So as long as I feel that my goals are being met, which is increasing visibility for ex-Muslims, helping people who are struggling with faith or have been questioning faith and don't know that there's an avenue out, helping them out, giving Muslims a different perspective on us and on their beliefs. All of these things are successes in my book. So I don't measure success by how many Muslims leave or how Islam fails or wins. I measure it by how many people I'm able to help and how many people find each other because of us being vocal. Let me just for a second deal with a spammer. Okay. I'll read a few more comments. Now is your chance to leave comments if you'd like, if you want them to be read. Can't think of anything else that I wanted to add, but I'm probably missing something. Yeah. AZ says, if Islam is the truth, why has it been over 1,500 years and the Middle East is still in shambles? Are God's words this weak? I don't know if that I would take that as definitive proof that Islam is not true, but it does bring into, again, narratives. A Muslim can easily wave this question away by thinking, well, it's a test. Just because people are Muslim doesn't mean that they're following properly. People are fallible. It doesn't mean that God's gonna, make everything work for Muslims and not work for non-Muslims. If anything, Muslims somehow rationalize this as God gives the kuffar what they're owed in this life so that he can punish them harder in the afterlife or something like that. So there's ways to explain it away. I wouldn't find this to be, a good reason why Islam is not true. However, it is a good argument to put forth, as in, if God revealed his final, most perfect guidebook, and somehow that guidebook is not even able to demonstrably help people thrive in this life. If anything, that part of the world is suffering. I'm not saying it's directly because of Islam, but it's in spite of supposedly Islam's perfect revelation and so on. I guess it demonstrates that it's not really that good of a guidebook at the very least, or at least in this life, it's not really helping Muslims. Ziad Ismaili says, one thing I find strange about arguments based on scientific miracles, in quotation, is that those arguments could definitely not have been convincing to humans centuries ago. How are they convinced then? That is a very good point. Like when someone says linguistic miracle, like if you look at the Arabic and you look at how many words are here and you count the words and stuff, this is amazing, therefore it proves God is real. It doesn't, but let's assume it does. Then how can a person who doesn't speak the language know this, or a person who can't read know this? We're talking right now in the age of the internet. Sure, maybe like if you really squint and try to stretch it, you don't have a point, but let's guarantee that you do. What about all the other people? And the answer to that is that there's never really one proof of Islam. There's never really one argument that this makes Islam true. There's the shotgun approach of here's, 20, 30 things, choose whatever you see fit. And if you shut down a few of them, well, there's still 20, 30 more. So it's not a good argument to me either. Was it relevant a few years ago? Let's see. More comments, please. What is this? AG says, plot twist, Muslims start worshipping ChatGPT when it gives better answers than their scholar. No, I don't think so. Okay, here's a question, I guess, that it relates to the main question here. How can someone know this fact and then continue to be a Muslim? Let me try to answer that. Let me put my Muslim hat on. Does the Quran not say you can take slaves and have sexual right over them? This alone should push people away. So the thought process here is that if you're a reasonable, empathetic person and you come across this verse that says you can own slaves and you can have intercourse with them, which is an unfair situation, why wouldn't you then conclude that this cannot be from a fair God? This cannot be just. This cannot be what, the ultimate expression of fairness is. Therefore, I don't believe in this. That's what you conclude. And honestly, that's easy for me to conclude. From a Muslim's perspective, there's so many avenues to get out of this. Well, does it actually mean slaves? No, it means something else. I don't know. This is too complicated. I'm not going to think about it. I don't want to go to hell. That's one way. There's also, don't talk to me. I'm not an expert. Go talk to the other experts. I'm assuming that all the other people out there who are empathetic and smart have done the thinking and have found a resolution. Otherwise, there wouldn't be so many Muslims in the world. That's another avenue out of this. Another way to think about it is, well, it was a different time, and slavery was a fact of life, and this is actually the most merciful and humane way to go about doing it, and so on and so forth. And you can't just look at it from your narrow perspective, your biased 21st century perspective, your human mind, and think this wasn't the best thing for the time. God has a reason for everything, and so on and so forth. So there's multiple ways to rationalize these things. Just because the answer seems obvious to you, and maybe should seem obvious to most people, the answer is that was just a human and he was working with what he thought, and this is not at all anything about God. Just because that answer is obvious to you doesn't mean that it's obvious to someone who's invested their entire life into this belief. And it's not even something that they contend with daily. Like, Muslims don't think about slavery today. They don't have to deal with slavery. So it's not something that's near and dear to their heart. It's not something that comes to mind. But there are ways to explain away everything. Let's see. I mean, when you think about slavery, again, this narrative that Islam was here to free slaves, there are better ways to do it. I mean, you don't legalize slavery and make it so that you can go buy a slave, regardless of how they were captured. Even if Islam were to restrict taking slavery, taking new slaves to just during war or something, which, again, unfair, but sure. You can still go buy a slave and you don't know how they were captured. Like, there's so many avenues for slavery to continue under Islam, and it has continued under Islam, unfortunately. So, yeah. Let's see. AG says, everyone can survive without Islam. If Islam is successful in its goal, no one else can survive. What's the solution? I don't think it's fair to say if Islam is successful, no one can survive. If we all were to be under Islamic ruling, non-Muslims can survive, but with a lot of concessions and a lot of humiliation and, paying jizya and so on and so forth. And I don't know if like most Muslims in the world would want that to happen these days. I'm just saying, by the book, that's how it was. What's the solution? I think the solution, at least one of the solutions, I don't know the ultimate one, but it's to let people know that there's a way out, and to let them know that they're not under duress. There is nobody holding a gun to their head saying, you're going to go to hell, be tortured forever if you don't believe in this stuff. So solution number one is to show examples of people leaving, increase education, One thing I forgot to mention is the lack of critical thinking in education in Middle Eastern countries. I can speak from experience. The way that we think of education is more like memorizing. It's you need to know all these facts, you need to do well in your exams, and so on and so forth. With exceptions, of course. There are a lot of people who think critically, but for the most part, it's not something that's encouraged or taught in the culture and in education. So critical thinking skills are underdeveloped, and religious narratives take precedent. So it's hard to direct critical thinking at religion when you barely practice them to begin with. Yeah, what else? I'll read a few more comments and then we'll call it a stream. It's been a very successful stream so far. Thank you everyone for being here. If you liked any particular part of the stream, leave the timestamp in the comments below. I really like when people do that. Leave a comment, leave a like, all that kind of stuff. Really helps the channel and helps more people find this live stream and this video. Is the mask to protect his identity from leaving Islam? Short answer is yes, for anonymity. Because I still, for multiple reasons, I still have to go to the Middle East sometimes. I don't want to be a public figure that is known by name and face, and then I might face legal consequences. And I have family and friends who still are in the Middle East, and I don't want anything bad to happen to them by proxy, either legally or because someone got really mad at something I said, or just at the fact that I'm a vocal apostate and tried to take revenge on them. So for now, at least, I wish I didn't have to, but that's why I wear a mask. It also kind of helps to sort of not feel, always in the spotlight. Like I can, take a walk after this and hopefully no one recognizes me. I like it that way. Muslim says Quran preaches freeing slaves and it did not legalize it. It just pre-existing problem. It did legalize it. It was a pre-existing problem. Islam continued it. I don't trust me. Go look it up. And that's something that I want to remind people of. Never take my word for Bible, for gospel or for Bible was the expression. I don't know. Never take my words to be facts. Go look it up yourself. I'm just telling you the distillation of what I found, but none of what I say is, something that I conjured from thin air. It's all there in the books. Debor says, are you growing your hair? Yeah, a little bit. You noticed. Couple more comments. Now's the time. What else? Oh, that's a good point. Kit Kat says, the Prophet's grave does exist in Medina, so at least we can confirm Muhammad existed. I mean, we don't know if there's a body there. I've prayed in front of the Prophet's grave before. I've seen it myself. Something that I was taught as a Muslim is that the earth does not take the bodies of prophets and possibly martyrs and good people and so on, but at least for prophets. So their bodies will not decompose. And I remember since I was a kid, I was asking, so that's the Prophet's grave? They told me, yes, this is where Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam and so on was buried. And I asked, so his body's right there under the ground, not decomposed. And they said, yes. I said, why didn't anyone exhume him and prove to the world? Because again, I was thinking in an Islam-centric mindset. If the world is conspiring against Islam and, people hate when the truth comes out, then shut them all up. Show Muhammad's body, somehow, live stream it, somehow prove that this body was exhumed and it has not been touched by the earth. That's kind of a non sequitur now that I think about it when I'm older. This is something that we cannot explain. It doesn't mean, therefore, the explanation is God or the specific God, but at least it's something. If Muhammad is buried right there, why can't we just show everyone that his body is still there? The answer, of course, is, that it's disrespectful to exhume his body and so on, but it's the smoking gun right there. Prove that Islam is true. Exhume Muhammad. That would be interesting. But that would be very blasphemous for a Muslim to do. Emma, I guess this is the last question. Emma says, I'm a new subscriber, so forgive me if you've already explained this. Does your family know about you leaving the religion? If so, how did you break the news to them? I'm unsure if I'll ever be able to. This is yet another example of, someone who doesn't believe but is not visible and will be counted as a Muslim. So when I ask why don't Muslims leave Islam, even when they do, you wouldn't know about it. I'm sorry that it's such a struggle for you, Emma, to come out to your family. Very briefly, like I can't talk too much about my family situation because I don't want them to be put in harm's way. But if you want to tell your family about it, first you have to consider your own safety. Make sure that you are independent to some extent in case things don't go very well. You know your family better than I do. Plan for how things could go wrong, and is it really necessary to have that conversation at this point? Is it weighing on you to not be out? You have to decide what is best for you to do, and think of all the avenues you could take this. Talk it over with other people who have done the same thing, and then come to an action plan. It's hard for me to give a generic advice because every situation is different. Someone, for example, living in the UK with their family in a very highly restrictive Muslim neighborhood or community has a different situation than someone in Australia who lives by themselves away from their family, or someone in Jordan who lives with their family, or so on and so forth. Um, but point is, think of your well-being first and foremost, and figure out an action plan that is most likely to, be beneficial for you. Apostle Aladdin, when are you going to water your plants? I do it regularly. Thank you very much. Actually, these ones are doing pretty well, all things considered. I'm struggling with a spider mite problem every now and then, but they seem to be doing fine. There's one that's dying, but it's off camera, so that's all good. You may not believe this, but these vines right here, that's spinach. Where is it? This right here, that's spinach. I didn't know it could grow that way till I knew, and I got some. Anyway, thank you everyone for joining. Thanks for being here, for your support, for your questions, your answers, and everything. I really could not do this without you. Thank you for the moderators and for the people helping behind the scenes, my backstage helper. I really appreciate it. Don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a comment, all that good stuff. Stay tuned. I'll try to take calls starting next week on Wednesdays. The way I do it is I'll be posting about it a day or two before. Check the channel, and 30 minutes before the live stream is supposed to begin, you click the link and you verify yourself as a caller. So keep that in mind. Thank you to the supporters on Patreon and YouTube members, and the donors and everyone who's on the community, the Discord server. I could not do any of this without you. And Lean, how can I send you fan art? My email is in the About Me section of the channel. I really appreciate it. That's very sweet. And as always, think critically, think for yourself, and consider watching one of these videos next. Bye-bye.